Hello and welcome. Let's talk about enums in PHP. We're going to talk about the two different types of enums, basic and backed enums, and then we're going to go how to create each one, and we're going to talk about the features of enums. So let's jump right into it. All right, so here we have just a basic Laravel project. Laravel is not required by any means for this. I'm using this for ease of use, and it should still be easy to follow along. So let's go ahead, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a basic enum, and this is an enum that just has, almost like constant values. We can use these enums to define a set of constants. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a basic user status enum. And this was just, a class template or an enum template based off of PHP Storm. And so in these enums, we can define our various cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a case of active because these are user statuses. We're going to do a case as deleted, case for trial, and a case for unverified. Now, this is it. This is just a basic enum, and this is all that is required to define an enum. And so now that you've got this defined, you can use this, all throughout your app, and you'll be referring to these cases for your enums. So let's take a look at how you might actually use this enum now. So I have this Tinker console, and this is why I'm using Laravel. I have this Tinker console so that I can easily kind of just run these things and show easily on the screen. So if we just wanted to look at the enum, and we just did basic user status enum, and we just did, let's say, active, for example. And we can see down here on the bottom that we're given this enum, and it has a name of active. That name is referring to the case here. So if we were to do deleted, it would give us this name. And notice the return is actually an enum itself and not the name. So if you wanted to use this in some way where you wanted to use the name for some particular reason, you actually have to go enum and then name. And so if we just do enum name and we run this now, we'll see that we just get active, that string active. I'm going to comment this out and put this back. Again, going back to this, we actually get a basic user status enum back with this particular name. That's going to be an important concept as you're using this throughout your application, because you might be thinking that you're actually getting a value, but you're not getting a value. You're getting essentially almost like a class. So let's talk about how we might use this to figure out, whether or not somebody has access to premium features. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm just going to create a class inside of here so it's easy to see. And so I'm creating this function that we're going to use, and we're going to call it underneath it. And so now that we've defined this basic user status enum, we can start to type hint basic user status enum. And that's going to be one of the biggest benefits right there. So I'm just going to go ahead and import this so it's easier to read. And so now that we know that we are guaranteed to get one of these values, so when we type hint it, basically what it's saying is that you have to be giving that function one of these. And so because we know that's going to happen, I'm going to use the return match function. And we're going to say for certain types, for certain enums, they're going to have access to the premium features. Okay, so we're going to say, if we're going back here, we're going to say that anybody who's on a trial and anybody who's active has access to the premium features. So what we can do is we can do basic user status enum active and then say true. Basic user status enum trial true. We want those two to have access, and then we're going to say deleted should not and unverified should not. Now, without going too much into detail, with this match function, we could actually include two if we wanted. So if we wanted to, we could combine these two into a single line and this one also into a single line. So basically what this says is anytime we've hit active or trial, return true, otherwise return false. That's why we see the little squiggly lines here. I'm going to leave it like this so it's a little bit easier to read, but it's just a little tidbit that I wanted to point out. All right, so now that we've got this class and this function, and then we're using this type hint for the enum, let's go ahead and use it below. So we can say has access, and then we're gonna new up this premium features. We're gonna call the has access, and then we have to give it the enum, remember. So we're gonna say basic user status enum, and let's give it the active enum. So if we rerun this, we now get it true. If we put it as deleted, it should say false. And it does indeed say false. So this is going to allow you to type hint, and when you're working on a team and you're trying to do good architecture, having these structures, these data structures in place are going to make everybody's life easier. So I highly encourage the use of enums when you've got a set of defined constants that you might use throughout your application. Because one of the awesome things now is that when you're using your IDE, what we can do is we can start to, if we need to change something and we need to refactor something, we can just do this. And so most IDEs have like some sort of refactoring built in. So let's just say we want this to become activated now. We don't want this to become, we don't want it to be active. We want it to be called activated. So now when I use the refactoring tools in my IDE, it should have changed it anywhere that was being referenced. So if I go back to the enum, notice how it says activated. Again, it's just another one of those little things that ends up making a difference in the future, because we never really anticipate that things might change as much as they do, but chances are things are going to change. And so let's make it easy on ourselves by using these data structures to make it so that we can refactor easily. All right, so now that we've got the basic user status enum defined, one thing that I'm going to quickly talk about is that enums can actually have functions in them. So we can actually take this function and we can basically take this function and just put it on the enum and it will function very similarly. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to the enum and put this on the enum. Now we have to make a little bit of changes here. So we can just we can get rid of this and we can just say this. And this is going to refer to itself. And we can also do just self here, self here, self. All right, so how do we call this function? This function can just easily be called on a specific enum. So I'm going to put a Boolean here. So let's take a look at that. So let's get rid of this. And if we just do basic user status enum and we do deleted, we can just say has access to features. It's just a function on the enum. So any of the enums now have this function. So let's see what happens when we run it. We get the same results. And so if we do activated, we get the same result. So that's one way that you could potentially move the logic into the enum, but you want to be careful. You don't want to go crazy with the enums. Chances are you might want to keep, some of that logic separate. So let's move on to the next step. The next step is let's talk about backed enums. Backed enums actually have a value associated with the enum. So let's create that. So the way you define a backed enum is by putting a colon and then putting the type of value that will be associated with that particular enum. So if we take the example from our basic user status here, I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to paste it, and you can see that the IDE is actually complaining because there's no value. What we can do is say active. And I'm going to change this back to active. And so each one of these is going to be required to have this string value. And it's actually required if you do have an enum to put the type here. All right, so basically what this allows us to do is associate an enum with a value. And this is going to be important for things like inserting stuff into the database. If you want to use enum throughout your code base, and then finally when you go to insert something into the database, you might want a particular value. This could just be a U, for example. It really doesn't matter because throughout the code, you should be referring to the actual enum and not the value. The value is just the thing that would potentially just be into the database. All right, so let's take a look at how we use this and what kind of gets returned when we do use it. So let's check this out. All right, so we're going to do backed user status enum. And again, let's do active. And let's see what this active gives us. Import this. Okay, so similarly to the basic, enum, it has a name. And that's what you see here. But it has this additional property now, value. This is the value that we just assigned to it. So we've got these two kind of, so to speak, properties on the enum. And so if we want to grab that, we have to do enum arrow value. And so just assign this. So now when we run this, we should get active with a lowercase a. And that's the value that the enum has. Now, one quick little tip here is that backed enums can actually be used for casting in Laravel's like cast system for model properties. Go check out my other video if you're looking, how to use that in Laravel. It's super awesome. So now that we have this, let's talk about maybe one or two other features that I like about enums. Kind of going back to the thing where we did with the basic enum where we could put functions. On backed enums, I like to have labels because perhaps I might be using these, for a dropdown or, for something where we have to associate the values with a label. So I like to do a public function and then just do label. And we're going to use the match function. I really like the match function. Okay, so we're going to say if it's active, return active. If it's deleted, return deleted. And likewise going down. So there might be the case where you want, a label to be completely different than what the name is, etc. So this is where this comes in handy. So now that we got this label function here, we're going to say this returns a string. Let's just do, now when we come here, we can just call label. And this is going to give us just the string value, because remember, if we're just doing enum, it gives us the name and the value. And perhaps the name isn't necessarily going to be the label, and so that's where that label function is super helpful. All right, let's talk about two important functions that exist only on backed enums. So if we look at the backed enums, I'm just going to declare a variable so we can have it here. If we are using this backed enum and there's this function called from. And so imagine that maybe you have a request coming in or some kind of user generated or something that that's coming in externally. There's this from function. From will basically try to create an enum from this given value. So if we say from active, it's going to actually give us that active enum. So if we run this, we got the backed enum with active. Now, what this from function does not do is it won't give you a enum if you provide it a value that just doesn't exist. And so if we accidentally, let's say, the user accidentally typed in active with two E's. If we go and try this now, the IDEs are smart enough to detect this, but if we try and run this, PHP is actually going to throw an exception because this enum does not exist. So PHP has another function called try from. And so what this is going to do is that this is basically have like a try catcher on this so that it fails gracefully. So let's see what happens when we use the try from in this case. In this case, it returns null because there is no such enum that has active with two E's. These are two kind of cool functions that you can use when the data is coming externally and you want to make sure that your data is tight because this is going to guarantee when you're using these enums throughout your code base, it's going to guarantee that this is what it says it is. Let's talk about another awesome function that we have in both backed and basic enums. So if we looked at backed enum, there's a function called cases. And so what that's going to do is give us all of the cases in an array for the enum. So let's look at the cases for the basic enum and see how they differ. Notice before I switch that just like the other stuff, it has the enum as sort of like the class, and then each of them have a name value. But as you'd expect with the basic, it just gives us the enums with only a name because that's all they have. So a couple interesting features that enums have. Enums can actually use traits. So if you had a trait, you could use, some enum trait. Let's say you wanted to include this label function in many different places, or let's say you wanted to include this has access to premium features in multiple places, you could do that. You just put it in a trait, and just the same way that you do with the class, you just say use, and then you just include it there, which is super awesome. Another interesting thing, along with kind of, the way we can compose objects, is enums can actually implement an interface. So if I were to just put in, let's say, this application interface, there's going to be too many things here, but enums can implement interfaces. There are some caveats with the traits. So when you're using a trait, I'll back the interface out. So when you're using a trait, the traits cannot have properties on them because enums don't have properties. And so PHP will throw an error if you are using properties in your trait. They can only include methods and static methods. Otherwise, an error will be thrown. Another interesting feature is we can actually use constants. Or we can define constants. So if we wanted to say just some random constant, hello, we can then go and use that. The same way we'd kind of do with a case. So if we run this, we get the value of the constant. So it's just another one of those things in your tool belt that you can use for enums. Now you might be wondering, what's the difference between a class and an enum? You've probably noticed that there's a lot of similarities. So if we looked at the cases, you've noticed a lot of similarities. Like it looks like an enum has properties, and it looks like, when we're getting an enum back, it looks like a class. It looks like that we're getting a class back. And so there are some differences between enums and classes. So let's go over those briefly. An enum cannot have a constructor or a deconstructor. So you won't be newing up an enum, so you won't be doing new backed enum. It doesn't exist. And your IDE would probably complain. So if I did enum equals backed equals new backed enum, it's already complaining, telling me that you cannot instantiate an enum. So another thing is that you cannot actually extend, there's no inheritance. So you can't extend backed enum. This is not allowed. Enums just cannot extend other classes. Inheritance doesn't exist. Static or object properties are not allowed, so we can't be putting this is just not allowed. There's just a whole slew of errors here. The editor's having a hard time with which it should be, and this is why we rely on our tools, whether you're using PHP Storm or VS Code or some other editor. They should be helping you kind of figure out, when stuff is allowed and when it's not allowed. This isn't a thing in enums. You cannot clone an enum, so we can't be using clone with backed user status enum. and deleted. We can see here that my IDE is underlining it because it's telling me that you cannot clone enums. So if you want to learn even more information about enums, a lot of the information that you see here was found in this website here. This is php.net/enums. PHP has wonderful documentation, and I highly recommend using that to your advantage. They've got a lot of good examples, and they break down how to do some of these things. So check that out if you'd like. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you found this video useful, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm happy to continue making more videos. It's super helpful for my channel and helps encourage me to continue making more videos. I look forward to hearing in the comments how you're going to use the enums or how the enums helped you kind of architect your code better.